All right, let's go ahead and move on to another huge story here. So on the very day that the ICJ ruled Israel is plausibly committing a genocide in the Gaza Strip and, compelled them to take actions to end those assaults, which are contributing to the potential genocide conditions. On that very day, and that timing is not an accident, Israel released intelligence to the U.S. that 12 employees of the UNRWA, that's a UN refugee agency that deals with Palestinian aid, were involved in some way in the October 7th attacks. Let's put this up on the screen. This allegation, the details of which have not been released to the public, by the way. And, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but we certainly know the Israeli government has been caught lying many times in the past, including in the context of October 7th. Those allegations have led 8 countries and the US, so 9 countries total, to stop funding that critical UN aid agency in Gaza. The numbers I saw, there's something like 13,000 UNRWA staffers in Gaza. 12 of them are accused of being somehow involved in October 7th. Put this next one up on the screen, actually. Those who were accused have actually already been fired by the UNRWA. In addition, I think 2 of the dozen who were accused have actually already been killed, but the others have been let go. And so at the very moment, Saagar, when the ICJ is saying you have to allow in more humanitarian aid, Gazans are starving, you have to end the conditions that could be contributing to a genocide. On that very day, the response from the US is to cut the funding to the most essential aid organization in the Gaza Strip, thereby further denying Palestinians access to the basics of life that they are required, all because of the allegations against a tiny, 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 minuscule fraction of the staffers there who are on the ground.
Yeah, Israel and the UNRWA have always had let's say, a bad relationship, especially most recently between the UN and the Human Rights Organization. Their general allegation is about those 12. There was also an interesting new piece. It literally just broke this morning, so I was just reading it right now, Krystal, from the Wall Street Journal, where they estimate, the Israelis shared with the Journal and claim that about 10% of its Gaza staff, quote, have ties to Islamist militant groups. The thing is, though, is that as I began reading, much of this came down to like guilt by association. They say that 1,200 to 12,000 of the 1,200 employees, quote, have links. And by links, they just say that they have close relatives who belong to the militant groups. This is part of the problem that I have with a lot of this is that, look, if these 12 people were involved in the attack, obviously horrible, we should be fired, etc. But in general, there seems to be like a lack of reality about who was governing the Gaza Strip. It's obviously Hamas. Also, guys, you can't be a member of a rival party in the Gaza Strip under the Hamas leadership and not be targeted for death. It's kind of the same thing that we could have said whenever we invaded Iraq and we're like, oh, well, they were belonging to the Ba'ath Party. It's like, yeah, but you had to belong to the Ba'ath Party if you wanted to do the most basics of civil government. Now, this is, again, according to the Israeli intelligence estimate and more, I think it's probably and almost certainly an attempt, to try and to cut off, because the UNRWA has been such a vocal and potent critic of Israel. And anytime you can try and to diminish the organization, especially in the eyes of the West, the bigger problem that I see here is that we just seem to be taking the Israelis' word for it themselves, because the U.S. in its statement did not immediately say whether it had its own intelligence to that effect. Furthermore, as I said with this Wall Street Journal report, it is relying entirely on Israeli military estimates, which certainly could be true, but they need to declassify the intelligence, share it with the world. I mean, if you're going to be going after the people who are the only ones who are actually delivering humanitarian aid, well, then you need to provide some evidence, really to that effect. So this is actually a very tried and true strategy that we saw during the Iraq War and more, and we're seeing the Israelis play it out here again. And obviously, it's to their domestic political benefit. Like, let's not forget that.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things going on here. First of all, there's that high level, like philosophical conflict between Israel and the UNRWA. The full name of that agency is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. And so their contention is basically like, by allowing Palestinians who were, kicked off their land and multi-generations of Palestinians to continue to see themselves as refugees, it keeps them from integrating into the surrounding communities and basically like giving up their, claim to any sort of a state. So that's especially on the right, the philosophical opposition to the UNRWA. They're always looking for a way to, attack them, undercut them, et cetera. There's also the level of, again, it's not an accident that these allegations were put out there and the U.S. funding cut on the very day of the ICJ ruling. It's a classic distraction tactic as well. And, the U.S. news media immediately took it up. The ICJ ruling, which is incredibly consequential, which basically sided with South Africa on every piece, but did stop short of calling directly for a ceasefire, although it did say, hey, you got to stop doing the things that are creating the conditions that could plausibly be a genocide. That incredibly consequential ruling got buried in the Western press by these allegations about the UNRWA. And it also fits, hand in glove with the strategy they use. It's a meme at this point of like anyone who disagrees with them or that they don't like is Hamas. The UN is Hamas. The hospital workers are Hamas. The schools are Hamas. The premature babies that were left to die are apparently Hamas. So South Africa was they at the ICJ argued South Africa is basically Hamas or doing Hamas's bidding. So that is their strategy. And listen, again, I don't put it totally out of the question that with a large agency of 13,000 people, that there aren't a few that had some hand in October 7th. I don't put that out of the question.
That's right.
The answer to that isn't, if that is indeed what happened, which we should not take the Israelis at their word on anything, but if that is indeed something that happened, okay, you fire them, you weed out the bad apples, and you move forward, because the mission of the UNRWA has never been more critical than right now, when you have half of all people in the Gaza Strip starving, when you have 80% going regularly without a single meal a day, you have effectively the entire population completely displaced, living in squalor, communicable diseases spreading like wildfire, no sanitation, no clean drinking water, no basic medical supplies. Okay, their mission has never been more critical. And so again, to see the response of the U.S. on the day when this ICJ says they may be committing a genocide and pointing routinely to the humanitarian conditions, this was really at the center of that ruling, pointing routinely to the humanitarian conditions facing Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And our response is, let's make those humanitarian conditions even worse because of some allegations that the Israelis have put in front of us. I mean, it's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. There's no other word for it.
Yeah, and Krystal, you flagged one of our producers, an interesting segment that came from within the Israeli government that kind of specifically talked about targeting UNRWA only days ago.
So earlier this month, just on January 4th, a former Israeli official was basically testifying in front of the Knesset, and we can put this up on the screen. I'll just paraphrase what she's saying here in Hebrew. But she directly targets the UNRWA and says it will be impossible to win the war if the UNRWA is not destroyed. And her point is basically sort of like what I was saying. Oh, well, they create and propagate this idea that leads to the creation of more and more terrorists. Well, what is that idea? The idea is that Palestinians have legitimate rights to statehood. Whereas, people like this and many others ideologically believe that even the sort of like theoretical concept of the UNRWA leads Palestinians to continue to hold out hope that they want to see them lose. They want to see them abandon that hope. And so it's very noteworthy that you have just earlier this month, not very long ago, this official testifying before the Israeli parliament saying, we have to destroy the UNRWA. And then lo and behold, They roll out these allegations that lead to the US and a bunch of other countries cutting the funding and very much threatening the future survival of the UNRWA. Again, Saagar, at a time when its mission has never been more vital and never been more critical.
There's also been some major domestic turmoil inside of Israel, where there's a group of protesters who are actually blocking any humanitarian aid from entering the Gaza Strip. Let's put this up there on the screen. This is from the Times of Israel. They say for a second day in a row, protesters are blocking aid reaching Gaza from Israel, including some families of hostages at the Kerem Shalom border crossing, urging the government to not allow any supplies in until captives held by the terrorists are freed. So it's interesting to me, Krystal, because there are ceasefire protesters in Israel who I've watched get cracked down upon almost immediately. But these protesters who have been blocking aid have been very much allowed. And I think it obviously fits with the general orientation of the Netanyahu government and of the different ways in which they're pulled, where if you're against the war, or even really if you're against a war strategy, not even against the war itself, then they are very willing to crack down, to use the state to throw you in jail and to break it up. But if you are, I wouldn't even say pro-war, but if you were like pro the aims of the right-wing government, which does certainly advance them, then they allow it to happen. It's one of the most classic examples of like using the law selectively that we watched happen domestically. And it is clear too about which message that they want to allow to propagate inside of their media for their domestic populace.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So some of the family members of hostages were involved in these protests to cut off aid. Others, as I know you guys covered last week, stormed the Knesset and are furious because it has become incredibly apparent and undeniable that the aims of the war are inconsistent with the aims of bringing the hostages home. I mean, it's just sort of basic logic that if you're bombing the hell out of a place, you're putting all the people who are there at risk. The only time they have had any success at bringing hostages back was during that brief ceasefire, those 6 days of a brief ceasefire. That was the only time. And in fact, of course, they murdered some of their own hostages because they thought they were Palestinians, in spite of the fact that they were, trying to surrender and had their shirts off to show they weren't a threat, et cetera, et cetera. So the capability of having the intelligence or the ability or the wherewithal or whatever to go in and militarily get these hostages out, that has not worked whatsoever. So, that continues to be a pressure point for the Netanyahu government. I'm sure you saw, Saagar, there's some new supposed potential hostage deal, and there's a potential 2-month-long ceasefire that is being in some stages of negotiation. We'll see whether that comes to fruition or not. But I think part of the reason why that would even be on the table is certainly because of the domestic upset within Israel. I also think that the ICJ ruling, I do think that is putting pressure on the Israeli government because they, could become a pariah state the way that South Africa did. This is the first time that the word genocide by any sort of international body has even been, associated with Israel whatsoever. You have seen the way that some of their comments have been at times moderated. We're hearing less, for example, about, all the ethnic cleansing plans, although we're starting to hear more about it as they see that the U.S. is going to back them no matter what. But also critically, some of the countries that they were reportedly going to, like the Congo, to say, hey, will you take in these Palestinian refugees? They're now saying absolutely not, because they don't want to aid and abet what has been deemed plausibly genocide by an international body. So those are some of the pressure points that are leading to maybe some sort of renewed deal with regard to the hostages and some temporary cessation of their assault on Gaza.
Yeah.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.